Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing. My name is Jim Schottenham, curator here at the museum. And today we're coming to you from the Selch Backman Fly Room on the first floor of our Manchester location. I've had a pretty interesting lineup of reels to talk with you about today. And of course, I have the good fortune of being joined by my guest, Michael Hackney, who's going to join us a little bit later to talk about some of the 3D printed reels and innovations that arose from the use of plastics for fly reels. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with a reel that is immensely popular with collectors and anglers today, despite the fact it hasn't been manufactured for a number of years, and that is the Hardy Uniqua. The Hardy Uniqua has its beginnings dating back to 1903, and from the research done by John Druitt, in his book, he indicates that the earliest reels from that time frame, before they were advertised, were manufactured with a brass drum. That would be very distinctive, easy to pick out. But I'll go ahead and start showing you here. So here we have a Hardy Uniqua. These reels started out with this what we call a horseshoe latch. That was very innovative also in that it allowed the anglers to be able to remove the spool away from the reel to access their line very quickly. That large knob that you see at the end of the horseshoe would be easily slid away, exposing the spindle so that the spool could simply slide up and off. Those were manufactured from the beginning of the reel's production period up until about 1934. And in 34, the latch changed to a different style. And I'll give you a better look at that. So again, here we have an example of an early Hardy Uniqua, and that latch would slide away, allowing you access to that spool. So again, just a very simple mechanism, but it was very innovative, certainly something that they were very proud of. In 1934, the Hardy Uniqua changed over to this. This is what's referred to by collectors and historians as a telephone latch. Now, I was thinking about this. There's probably a fair number of people that aren't familiar with what a telephone latch is. Of course, back in the old days, when I was a youngster too, a telephone actually had a receiver that sat on a physical phone on the desk. And that's pretty much what the receiver looked like. You had the piece that went up to your ear and the other you used to talk into. This again operated to allow the angler to quickly take the spool off of the reel. These again changed in 1934, which will help date an example. If you have a Hardy Uniqua, you're not quite sure what range to put it in. So the earliest reels had that horseshoe latch. 1934 saw the horseshoe. Now, there are some reels that may overlap, certainly. Some of the other features on the reels did overlap, the check mechanisms, the reel foot, the finish, and that sort of thing. But again, it changed in 1949 to a latch that a lot of Hardy collectors are very familiar with. That's a small cap with a little spring lever. And I'm going to get my other protective glove on here and show you how that one works. So this was a very simple spring latch. You push that down, and once again, giving the angler access to the interior of the spool. You'll see here that this is what's called a duplicated Mark II. So there's an additional spare pawl and a spare pawl spring. These Hardy reels enjoyed tremendous success. They were very successful not only in England, but also here in the States. It's been recorded in John Druitt's book. Toward the back end, he has production numbers from 1923 to 1939. During that time frame, Hardy has recorded that they produced over 22,000 Hardy Uniquas, and that's just for that time frame. Keep in mind that the reels date back to the beginning of the 1900s until the last catalog listing for those reels in the 1950s. So a long time, 25 years thereabouts, very popular reel. In fact, it was so popular that there were reel makers here in the United States that took notice of that popularity and looking to perhaps capitalize on the popularity of a very effective reel design. We enter into the Meisselbach reels, Meisselbach Rainbow to be specific. And I am going to show you what those look like. That is a Meisselbach Rainbow trout reel. The Meisselbach reels were introduced in approximately 1915, 1916. And from their early advertisements, you can tell that they were at least aware of the Hardy Uniquas. They did allude to the fact that those reels were coming from England. In fact, in that 1918 catalog produced by Meisselbach, they stated in their advertisement, the rainbow reel, while similar in design and equal in mechanical perfection to the high-priced fly reels heretofore imported, is made to sell at a price within the range of the largest number of anglers. The rainbow reels did retail for a lesser price than the Hardy imports, but they also enjoyed some changes. The very first reels from Rainbow, Meisselbach Rainbow, also had that early horseshoe latch. They were typically done in a painted finish, and this is an example of an early Rainbow. And you notice the spool latch is nearly identical to that on the early Hardy reels. This lasted for just a couple of years until 1919, when they no longer provided that little horseshoe latch. In fact, the reels changed over to the screw that you see on this reel. Now, it's still relatively easy to take apart. You would simply use a coin. The coin would be used to unscrew that and take that spool apart. So it wasn't terribly difficult, but certainly not as convenient as that latch that they previously had. The other reels we mentioned, of course, have that simple screw. And as you can see, it's just a simple slotted screw. Again, you would take that off and get access to the reel. So the rainbow reels enjoyed great success for Meisselbach. It was the longest catalog reel and offered for the longest amount of time in the entire Meisselbach catalog. So they were offered in only two models. A model 627 was 2 7/8 inch diameter. The model 631 was their larger reel. They had some variations thanks to an exhibit that we had here in Manchester that was provided by an Orca member named Roger Schultz. Roger was kind enough to loan the museum a number of examples, and of course some box examples here. One of the earlier boxes from the rainbow reels. They went through some changes. They had foots with rivets. They went to a cast foot, and the last series of reels were stamped from the Elyria, Ohio location, and they lasted until 1939. Now, in 1939, the rainbow reels were still being sold. However, the names had changed. I'm going to scoot out of camera here just for a second. The names had changed a little bit. Now, one of the other interesting things is the rainbow reel was also sold through a number of retailers. One in particular was William Mills, and Mills sold these reels under the name Cresco. Apparently, the Cresco reels were available in the Mills catalogs simultaneously with the rainbow reels offered in the Meisselbach catalogs. We have a copy of a William Mills catalog here from 1926. And what's really kind of interesting, at least to me, is that in this particular catalog, both the rainbow reel and the Cresco reel are offered in the same catalog. So you'll see here is the Meisselbach rainbow reel, called the rainbow reel. And on the following pages, there is the Cresco reel. Same reel, different name, offered in the same catalog, which is somewhat unusual. The catalogs also reduced the price on those reels toward the end of the line to approximately $3 for the smaller size and $3.30 for the larger 3¼ inch reel. The Uniqua at that same time was in the same catalog, mind you, but the Uniqua was offered for $9. So you can see that the Meisselbach offered a much cheaper alternative for those looking for a relatively easy to use single action fly reel at a modest price. There were some reviews that maybe didn't tout the Meisselbach as the quality may not have been necessarily equal, but certainly a great serviceable reel, something that a lot of anglers used for a very long time. At the very end of the run, the reels were cataloged under different names, and I'm looking at my notes here. The Roadster and Streamster were the names that they used up until the end, which was approximately 1940, 1941, is when they ceased production on those rainbow reels. So that's a little bit of a 1,000-foot view on the history of one of the more popular reels, both from Hardy and certainly from Meisselbach. We're going to move on now to a reel that, thanks to another Orca member, specifically Lori Bingham. Lori was looking through her copy of A Treasury of Reels, which is a publication put out thanks to Jim Brown and the American Museum of Fly Fishing. In that book, there's a Pfluger, an Enterprise reel. It's a medalist for all intents and purposes that had a multiplying attachment to it. And the reel has, pull that up here for us. The reel has an emblem on the side plate, and you'll notice it's a stylized pair of letters that are intertwined. And we weren't certain, of course, what that was. It's certainly an attachment. There's no question that the frame itself is of a Pfluger reel, medalist to be specific. But what we've subsequently learned, thanks to research by Lori, there was an actual patent from Edwin Haenelt Jr., who was born in New York State in 1918. Mr. Haenelt patented his hydraulic braking system for reels. And in his patent, which was very long, it was a total of 9 pages long, he talks about providing brake systems for both fly reels, spinning reels, and other reels. But what's interesting is that in the patent, and I've got that up here for us to see, he talks about that it's well adapted for the purposes which is intended, but it is readily adaptable to existing reels. So I don't think that Mr. Haenelt built reels himself. I think he was looking to have an appliance that was attached to a fishing reel. There are other examples of Mr. Haenelt's reel. This particular reel is part of Ed Pritchard's collection. There's no emblem on it, which of course made it a little difficult to try to identify. And this is an example that showed up recently on an online sales platform. And of course, the seller didn't really know who had manufactured the reel. So this is some of the patent drawings. Again, these are from Mr. Haenelt Jr. Mr. Haenelt, his father was a diamond setter, and his father worked for a short time with Tiffany. Not much is known about Mr. Haenelt Jr., who also in the city directories was later listed as a diamond setter. I found no record of his reel making or reel modifying business. However, we know that based on these patent drawings, that he was certainly involved in that. And I suspect strongly that the multiplying gears that you see under the side plates of the particular reel that we have here in the museum is certainly a multiplying gear that's hidden underneath that plate. And forgive me, I didn't want to take this apart on camera for obvious reasons. I don't want parts to go flying everywhere. But if you happen to have a copy of the Treasury of Reels, you can find that this particular reel is on page 89. So if you want to make a note to put that in there, again, the gentleman's name is Edward Haenelt, Haenelt Jr. Mr. Haenelt passed away in 1977 after moving to Florida, moved to Port Richey in 1976 and passed away a year later. So again, great information on a previously unknown maker, and it's certainly understandable. The emblem that's on there is not easy to decipher. I'm not sure that anyone would have looked at that and said, "Oh, that's a Edwin Haenelt reel." So thank you to Lori, we now have a proper identification for that. One of the other great discoveries, and this one really had me excited when talking to another fellow Orca member, Steve Vernon. Steve had discovered a very interesting article in the Patterson Weekly Press in 1883. And what this did for me was solve a question that I think a lot of reel collectors often wonder about. And that is, when we look at early reels, and it doesn't matter if it's a fly reel, casting reel, we often find that these early examples have a reel foot that's been mangled, shortened, trimmed, cut, ground down. There's a lot of modifications that happen to those reel feet. And I believe that Steve has found the answer for why that practice stopped. Before 1883, there was really no standardization of sizes. So the rods that were used and the reels that were purchased didn't necessarily match up. But in this newspaper article, we'll note that anglers will be glad to learn that the National Rod and Reel Association has adopted a standard of reel plates and seats, and that all prominent manufacturers have agreed to adopt the standard fixed by the association. From this point forward, they talk about they're going to be standardized, and that is great news for reel collectors, because if that had gone on for a long time, there's a lot of reels that would have mangled feet. And to that end, I'm going to give you an example. This is an early ball handle reel in the museum's collection. And as you can see, that foot is not only asymmetrical, but you can see that it has been narrowed on the ends. It's been shortened on this side. It's not a full-length foot. And this wasn't done out of malice. That was done by an angler. And that angler in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, they needed to modify their reels in order to fit on rods of that same period. So until that Rod and Reel Association worked with the manufacturers to standardize things, that's why we see a lot of reels with feet that are just mangled. So as collectors, we may not be thrilled to find a great piece only to see that the foot has been shortened, but I think we're going to find that there's obviously a particular reason for that. They needed to do that. The reels were meant to be fished. Back in the 1870s, 1880s, they didn't purchase a reel just to put up on a shelf to admire. They used them. In order to do that, they needed to adjust the size of the reel foot to fit the rods. And as one of the great examples of this, everyone, of course, is familiar with the 1874 Orvis patent fly reel. These reels came with a full-size foot, and you'll notice, if you can, there's a little scribe mark on the top side of the foot. These reels very, very often are found with feet that are shortened on either side. The reason for that, even within their own company, Orvis, this is an Orvis rod. It has an 1882 patent Eggleston reel seat. This reel sold by Orvis, this rod sold by Orvis, will not fit on that reel seat. That reel foot is too long. So if a person purchased an Orvis reel, wanted to use it on their brand new Orvis rod, they would need to cut the foot down on this reel. So that's why we see a lot of those reels with feet that are shortened, filed, and otherwise mangled. So we can't really fault the anglers of the day for doing that if they wanted to utilize their reels. Before the reel foot became kind of a plate, as we just saw, there were a number of other methods that were used. And I'll back up for just a moment. The National Rod and Reel Association, for those that are interested, was formed in 1882. So it didn't take them long to start tackling some of the bigger issues facing anglers of the day. Before that foot that appears on reels like the Orvis, reels were attached to rods using different methods. One of the earliest, as you see here, is what we refer to as a spike foot reel. This reel would go through a hole through the center of the wooden rods that were used in the day, and secured, as you can see, using a wing nut on the bottom side. Predominantly, they would use a leather washer to prevent that from rotating and slipping around. but this predates the use of what we would refer today as a standard reel foot. From the spike foot reels came a clamp reel. Now, these are pretty much a friction fit. As you can see, the little butterfly screw on the reel here, and I have one that I'm going to show you. The little butterfly screw, this would fit and slide from the tip of the rod back toward the butt section of the rod. This particular example, you'll notice there's a couple of holes drilled in the side of that clamp. That was for the angler to more or less stitch or sew a section of leather on the inside to increase the hold on the rod as it slid down. So if you see these reels that have these holes in the side, there's a purpose for those. And again, that was to secure a pad of leather in order to secure that to the rods. So we have spike feet, clamp feet, and then the standard plates that were either cast or they could be found either riveted, screwed to the bottom of the reel frame. But at least now we know why we look at these early reels. And it took a number of years for this to catch on. Obviously, it wasn't something that happened overnight. So when you're looking at an antique reel that dates from approximately 1900 and earlier, it's very likely that you're going to find an example that has a foot that's been cut down. If it hasn't been, then I suspect the reels probably weren't used very much or very little, or they found an alternative method to secure that reel to the rods that they used. So some interesting information, I think, from that Steve was able to share with us. We're going to continue on talking about reel feet. And what we're going to talk about now is the use of a reel foot to identify a reel. Sometimes there are features of a reel that are similar across a number of examples. And that's the case with this. This is a reel that is in the museum's collection. It is currently in our satellite gallery in Springfield, Missouri. It's a circa 1870s side-mounted fly reel from New York State. This reel is about 3 3/4 inches in diameter, and you'll notice that it has a very unique cast foot. This reel is also featured in the book A Treasury of Reels. However, to date, we've not been able to determine the manufacturer. This is not a reel that was a one-off. How do we know this? Well, there are a number of other examples that I'm going to share with you. And my reason for sharing this and showing this particular reel and kind of expanding on the reel foot is that I'd very much like to learn who made these reels. As I mentioned, there's other examples that have that same Y-shaped split, the same cast foot on early side mount reels. This is also a 3 3/4 inch diameter reel. Has the same foot. It's also unsigned. The same maker produced this little tiny reel. Again, you can see that little splayed foot. This reel is just under 2 inches in diameter, just a little tiny thing. We have yet another example. Again, the same foot with that splayed mark. This reel, I suspect, is a little earlier than the last two that I showed. The handle on this particular reel is fixed right to the spool face. And then we have another smaller version of the reel that's in the museum's collection. And again, we're looking at that splayed foot. So this maker was prolific, did make a number of reels, different styles of spool, but one thing that's common across all of them is that foot. And it's my hope that if you happen to cross any information, or if you see another example and you have information to share, I'm hoping that you'll reach out to the museum. You can find my contact information there. I'm really hoping that someone has information they can share so we can finally come up with a solid manufacturer for those reels, one of which is in the museum's collection at the Springfield Gallery. Another reel that we're going to talk about today, we pop out of this, is a plastic reel. This was the invention of Adam Hipernowski. Adam was a Buffalo, New York maker. He patented this reel in 1948. And what's interesting is that all of the Hipernowski reels that I'm aware of are all made of plastic, but Mr. Hipernowski did not mention plastic in his patent drawing. The design is the same on almost all the reels. What's changed a little bit are some of the grasp. This grasp in the patent drawing matches the reel that's in Lori Bingham's collection. It's a smaller Hypernowski fly reel, but it's made out of plastic. Mr. Hypernowski did produce a number of these reels. They're not marked. At least none of the examples that I've seen have any indication on them that he produced them. However, there are enough of these, and certainly not a lot of identifying marks aside from what we see in the patent drawing. But all of his examples do have those same traits, and again, they're all made out of plastic. So plastic reels have been around for a while, but plastic reels have also received an upgrade recently. And I'm going to bring in my guest, Michael Hackney. Michael, thank you for coming in today.
Glad to be here, Jim.
And before we get started on the 3D reel, I think we're talking about the Hypernowski reels real quickly. I think you have one in your collection as well.
I actually do.
And there again, it's a plastic reel, clear side plates. And what's interesting about this? What did you notice about that?
Well, there are two things, actually. One is the red anodized screws that hold it down. I've not seen photos or other examples that have anodized screws. The other is this actually does have a patent date sort of inscribed on it. It's not complete, but it's got the first first four numbers of the patent. I don't know about the others if they do.
which is at least a start. For
yeah.
right?
So at least you can tie it back to the patent.
Excellent.
So they're beautiful reels.
Well, that's kind of neat, and that is a plastic reel, and there's certainly some attributes that lightweight, easy to care for, but certainly I think you've taken the use of plastics to a much higher level. So why don't and I'm going to ask you to talk about the 3D printed reel.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess my story kind of starts before the 3D printing part of it, which is my interest in angling and angling history, and sort of the do-it-yourself aspect of that. I'm what's called a maker. I like to make my own rods, make my own flies. I actually make my own hooks. And of course, a reel was something that was kind of elusive. So I started thinking about making my own reels using hand tools. I'm also interested in early manufacturing technologies and not big machines, water-powered machines, but hand tooling in particular. And so around 2005-ish timeframe, I started working on making brass reels that are similar to some of the early examples that Jim has shown and you can find on the internet. And I was basically just wanting to try to make a reel from simple brass sheet stock material that was functional, that I could make with hand tools. There were no power tools used for this. I even used a hand drill to drill the porting holes and other things. Interestingly, Jim had the topic of the reel foot and sort of the history of that. The most difficult part of making these reels and some of the machined reels I got into later, and the 3D printed reels, and one of the reasons I got into 3D printing was the foot. The foot it has a complex geometry, and it also is the point of the reel that has the highest stress. It hanging there underneath the rod, it's got a lot of weight on it with the line, and as you're casting it, there's a lot of stress on a reel, and that juncture of the foot to the reel frame is under a lot of stress, and so you frequently find old reels where that's broken. And of course, if you're trying to make your own reels, you want to make sure that you've got that part of it covered. So I was making these reels, and then I got into CNC machining with a small desktop machine and was machining parts to make reels. And then this thing called the RepRap movement started. RepRap stands for replicating replicating rapid prototyping is what it stands for. It was started by a professor in England, and it was all about building low-cost, what we now call 3D printers that can print plastics. A sustainable plastic is what he really advocated, a material called PLA, polylactic acid, which is made from cornstarch. So you can literally grow corn and make PLA in your field. And the whole idea was to, and it still is, the mission is still viable, to make these printers that can make parts to make themselves that then could be put into third world areas that needed irrigation parts or cooking, spoons, forks and things like that, different types of products for everyday life that could be made, with these inexpensive reels. What actually happened, though, it became this global movement, and the whole desktop sort of personal 3D printing thing took off, and I got involved in it really, really early on because of my machining background. And I have a 3D printer, not the one I'm going to show you in a few minutes, which you might hear in the background, sitting next to my desk in my home office. And while I was playing around with my reels and doing up drawings to figure out what I was going to do next, I was looking at the reel foot. And as Jim mentioned, there was, and what was the year, 1870 for the reel foot? To standardize. And there is actually a standard today that specifies everything there is to know, what you need as a manufacturer to know about a reel foot. And actually, this particular plastic printed foot follows that standard. But to machine one of these in metal is not a trivial thing. And filing one with files can be done. That's how I did it in some of the early reels, but very, very time consuming. And so I started thinking, I've got this 3D printer. I'm making these brass reels. I wonder if I can make a foot in plastic that followed the specification that I could then attach to the reel and not have to muck around with machining feet. That actually didn't work very well because the brass part of the reel is too heavy, and these plastic pieces just basically disintegrated after a few casts, and not a great idea. But that got me onto the next train of thought, which was, I made the most difficult part of the reel. I wonder if I could make a whole reel out of 3D printing, 3D printed plastic reel. And so I set some goals for myself. The reel had to be completely 3D printed, no metal parts, no screws, no washers, no bearings. It had to fit modern reel seats, right?
Sure.
And it had to be fishable. And then I threw a couple of extras in there for myself. It had to be aesthetically pleasing, whatever that means. To me, that has a different meaning than maybe to someone else. But I had to be aesthetically pleasing. And so I set off kind of off and on for about a year. And it was almost exactly 10 years ago, like February-ish timeframe that I started this. And, I prototyped some parts, printed them. They didn't work. I went back to the drawing board, made some other parts. And eventually I ended up making this part, this reel, which is actually in the collection here at the museum. This is literally my very first fully functional, fully 3D printed reel. There's, no sort of drag mechanism, no click mechanism, very simplistic. I fished it a few times, but I was on to greener pastures. But this is, arguably not very attractive. It's kind of rough. My 3D printing skills back in that era were, not good. I mean, I look at it now and I'm like, this is not pretty at all. But this kind of set me on the path to do a couple of things. One was to design a much more functional reel, one that had a click check in it, one that looked a lot nicer. And most importantly, now because I was really developing an interest in 3D printing, to really exploit 3D printing and try to become a maestro at it, be able to print parts that came off the printer looking beautiful when, the other folks that were kind of hobbyists were printing parts they were cool. You had your Yoda heads and things like that, but you could tell that they were 3D printed and, they weren't going to pass for an injection molded plastic part. So that kind of got me going. I'm going to do a couple of things. I've got a few slides here just to kind of set the stage for how this form of plastic extrusion 3D printing works. Because even though we've seen it in the news, probably even seen it on television, I think it's good just to set the stage with a couple of photos to show you what 3D printing is. Before we go, this is an example of one of these more refined reels. This is also in the collection here. It's after, I don't know, about a dozen different iterations. And it's the reel design that I still use today in print, and one of my favorite color combinations.
That's a great color. And I have to stress that the first reel and this reel, all fully functional. As you mentioned, you took the reel out yourself to test it. So these aren't toys. These are functioning reels.
Yeah. So how does this fused filament printing work? Basically, if you think about it, it's very similar to the way you would make a coiled clay pot. You make these coils of, and then you make put down the base, and then you put another layer on top of it, another layer on top of it, another layer on top of it, and you build it up. And that's how you make a three-dimensional object with these two-dimensional layers. You could also do things like shape pancakes and stack pancakes to make buildings. There was a person who made an Eiffel Tower pancake using a 3D printer actually to print the pancake sections and stack it up. But that's the basic idea behind it. The objects are built from layers of the material.
Okay.
So that's how you get the 3D portion of it. And on the next slide, the way this works and now with the 3D printing is you start with a computer-aided design model, a CAD model. So this is a mathematical representation of the part that you want to 3D print, in software. And then with that CAD model, you can take it as 3D and you have to divide it up into what we call layers, these 2D layers, because it's the layers that get printed. That process is called slicing. And so there are software applications out there that will take your CAD model and slice it into those 2D layers and prepare them to be printed. And the next slide, once you have the slices, you literally start with the bottom slice, and your 3D printer basically has a few components. It has a heater, which melts a plastic filament, and the filaments are about a little less than 1/8 of a millimeter in diameter. I've got one
Did
here.
you want to show that?
Yeah, we could show that real quick. There are a couple of different standards, but this 1.7 millimeter diameter filament, you can see this is a kind of an amber color. It's not very big, but this gets melted in the heater and is pushed with an extruder through a teeny nozzle, which you can see at the bottom there. And that nozzle has a smaller diameter than the filament. It's usually sort of nominally 0.4 millimeters. Plus or minus. 0.4 seems to be the most common. So as you're pushing the filament into the heater, it's melting, and then that molten plastic is getting squirted out of the nozzle tip. And that wouldn't be very interesting, except that this whole mechanism is actually hooked up to a mechanical apparatus that moves it around, and it moves it under computer control. And I think if I have one more slide on that, yeah. So a computer is actually controlling the mechanism based on those slices from the CAD model and telling this what's called a hot end, this heater and the nozzle, to move around to create the first layer. And then once it's done that first layer, then the nozzle mechanism moves up the height of a layer and it prints the next layer and moves up and prints the next layer. And you're going to see all of this in operation on a printer here in a couple of minutes. But at the end of the day, that's basically what's going on until you've created your entire part. Now you can see here the model started as a pyramid that had perfectly smooth sloped sides, but the thing that got printed, because I'm printing it very thick layers, actually has a stair step on it. And that's sort of one of the considerations with 3D printing of all the technologies is what are called the layers or layer lines. And the thinner you make the layers, the less visible those are, but the longer it takes to print because you're printing many more layers.
And you have some examples of some of the parts here.
Yeah, I can just kind of walk you through. So this is another example of one of the parts out of my collection. It's one that I particularly like the colors, actually. I call this Tranquility because it has this very peaceful sort of blue-green and kind of an icy look to it. And so there are 9 parts that go into these reels, and I can kind of walk you through what they look like. And I'm actually printing 7 of them on the printer over here at once, so you can see that in a minute. So we've got the back plate, and this is a back plate, and it's actually printed on the bed like this, and it's got the axle in the middle that the spool resides on, and it's got your pillars. And you notice one of the pillars is a lot bigger than the other one. That's the one that the foot slides over. And so here's the foot, and you can see that it's got an interesting shape to it because it follows that the manufacturer's standard for reel feet. And it basically slides over that, and it's got a little locator section on it that keeps it from sliding down too far. So that was part of the design.
Very cool.
But part of that part of this design probably was a good 15% of the overall time I spent in designing the reel. The other part was on designing the spindle mechanism, so I would get free rotation without needing a bearing. And you might not be able to see it. I think Jim might be able to. It's actually not a cylinder. It's got little, it's almost,
oh, I see.
yeah,
I see.
it's like a gear.
Yes, it is.
It's like a gear. And that's because each of those little gear teeth lower the friction of the spindle running on it. And I can put a lubricant Vaseline or a grease in between, so it
I see,
lubricates,
I see.
and you get free motion without having to have a bearing.
Okay,
And and actually, this is what the spindle part of it looks like that slides over it. It slides over it, and it's got kind of a gear-like thing. That's the check. I'll show you and talk about in a second. So that would slide over the base plate, and as it spins, there's actually, I didn't point this out, but there is a teeny little piece of, I use zip ties, but you could actually 3D print them. I used to do that in the old days. It's made out of nylon or another 3D printable material called PETG. Needs to be more flexible than the PLA is. And that's how you get the check. And this check is actually asymmetric. So the wind in is very light, and then the payout is much heavier.
so you can tune these for
Yeah.
right hand or left hand retrieve.
You can tune these for right hand, left hand retrieve, and you can actually tune them for how much force on the retrieve.
Okay.
The payout. So yeah, a lot of flexibility there. So that's that part.
So before we continue on, just a couple of questions for you, Michael. So you mentioned the reel foot. Now, obviously, there's stress points involved. Did it take multiple designs to come up with something that would avoid and perhaps eliminate cracking,
Yeah.
breaking? I have to believe it.
Yeah, there was actually. And if you look at that foot on the original red reel, one of its weaknesses is the foot isn't circling the pillar on the bottom. There are actually two little well, they're little rods that are printed on the
I
foot
see
that
the
go
spacer.
through hole. Yeah, they go through holes on that the real part, on the frame part.
Okay,
And then they're actually melted on the back side to hold it in place. So it's not a very strong joint.
okay.
That's why this took me the longest to figure out. Where I finally ended up, and what actually worked really well, is there's this wider sort of oval pillar that the foot attaches to. So this is very rigid and very structurally sound.
Okay,
And then the foot itself actually has a banana-shaped hole in it that slides over that. And so it's also very rigid when it slides over it, and it doesn't go anywhere. It's there. It doesn't twist. It doesn't slide off. So yeah, that I don't even remember how I came up with that. It just kind of popped in my head, and I'm like, yeah, that's it. I tried it and it worked fine, and there we go. I actually, after I did this, figured out how to machine feet like this too. And so the reels that I manufacture in aluminum actually have a very similar foot design.
okay.
And it's an extremely strong design that doesn't require any, screws or anything like that to attach a foot.
Because rivets on a foot have a tendency to loosen up over time.
Yep.
Screws become loose. You have to tighten them down. Sometimes they're going to end up stripping.
Yeah.
Or you're going to strip the thread.
Exactly.
That's a great design.
Yeah, it
That's
worked
really
out
cool.
pretty well. And then sort of the other magic is the front ring, which you can see here, and you can see the pockets. And those pockets slide over the pillars. So one of them is bigger to fit over the foot pillar. And that is what makes this reel really strong. And in fact, the first reel and the first couple of iterations of it that I had, the pillars didn't fit into pockets on the frame. The pillars had just a little teeny plastic knob that stuck up that fit into a little teeny hole on the frame. And I used a little bit of super glue to hold it together, and they would just fall apart, after a couple of times fishing. With this pocket design, that frame is extremely rigid. I know a guy who, well, actually, the Hook Shots, which is the done by Field and Stream magazine, did a video, I think it's about 8 years ago, on the 3D printed fly reel, featuring a reel that I made for them. And they have a video of catching some monster brown trout down in some streams in Pennsylvania. I highly encourage going to YouTube and Google 3D printed reel Hackney, and that hook shot comes up. It's such a cool video. I literally watch it every week, and I have for 8 years. It's,
That's great.
Strokes my ego a little bit, but it's cool. And he catches some monster fish on it. And so that, so they do hold up and can actually catch some fish. So that's the basic frame design. And then there's just a few other parts. There's the back plate for the spool and the front plate for the spool, and they actually just kind of snap together. And then there's a handle, and I'm not going to take this apart because I'll never get it back in there, but the handle fits into a little, you can see it, a square hole there, and there's a spindle that slides through, and that's nice and freely rotating.
Sure.
And so these snap together, And then what actually holds them together is this check hub that I mentioned earlier. It slides up the middle of all of this.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That actually is what holds the whole thing together. So now it doesn't come apart. And I did cheat. I ended up having to compromise and say, okay, I'm not going to use any screws or any fasteners like that, but I will allow myself to use a few dabs of glue. So there are a few dabs of super glue on these reels. One of the dabs actually is what holds the spool to that. And then I usually do put a dab on each of the pillars that holds the top ring on, and then there's a dab that holds the foot in. And then one last dab I'll get to in a second. So that's the spool. And slop a little grease, or I use Vaseline on there, and it fits into the frame like that. And then there's a little retainer. I like those little horseshoe things. I've actually got some of those reels in my collection at home too, and I have thought a lot about how to make a latch mechanism to be able to remove these spools with with a line on them, so you could.
So just to recap, there's that little horseshoe latch on the early hardy Uniqua. So maybe you can come up with something that can 3D print something like that.
Yeah, I know it can be done today. When I was doing this, the 10 years ago or so, there wasn't a lot of choice in the types of plastics you could print. Sure. There was ABS, which is what Legos are made of, and that's what that red reel is made from. It's a little bit more flexible.
It's incredibly lightweight.
These are extremely light reels.
They are.
Yeah. And then there's the PLA, the polylactic acid I mentioned, which was, probably the most popular at the time. But today you can get all kinds of really interesting and very exotic materials. You can get carbon fiber filled PEEK, which is a really high temperature engineering plastic. And I'm able to print all of these things now. So I can print some pretty sophisticated reels and little latching mechanisms like that in PEEK and other materials. Nylon, you can print nylons. PETG, which is what Coke bottles are made out of.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of a cool material. Maybe I'll get inspired to do that. I've kind of not done any work on the design for a while because I've actually gotten into doing 3D printing as my vocation. I run the software team for a big 3D printing company, and the reels were where my passion was. So that's and I mentioned the little spindle retainer that kind of fits in there that holds it together, and then you've got the mechanism, the whole thing, works.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's the basic reel. Then, the next part of it was the design aesthetics. And if you could go back to that Sublime Green reel,
sure,
which actually is my favorite reel. I printed two of these. One of them is in the museum collection here in the case upstairs, and the other one is in my desk at work. So my objective here was, and at the time, 8 years ago or so, when I was getting into the aesthetics of this, people were trying to make 3D printed parts look like injection molded parts, which I think is a losing proposition. So what I did was look at it and say, okay, how do I embrace the manufacturing technology, the 3D printing technology? What's unique about this process that I could potentially exploit and incorporate it into the design aesthetics? And the first one is the layering. So as we saw, and you'll see in the printer in a few minutes, you print it in layers, and there is a visible layer line. And so I wanted to be able to incorporate that so it wasn't visually distracting to the final product. And when you look at one of my reels, the way I accomplish that is the way that they're oriented on the, maybe flip back, the way they're oriented on the bed. So that part is printed on the bed here, and this part is printed here. So the layer lines are in this short direction here, and you see them when you look at it end on, but you don't see it when you look at the flat face. Mm-hmm. When you look at the flat face, you're looking at a surface. Oops. Oh, that's gone. You look at a surface that was on what's called the bed of the printer. So it's nice and smooth. Thank you. So it's nice and smooth, and you don't see those layer lines. So that's one piece of it. And the other piece of it, if you could flip back to that picture again.
Of course.
The other piece of it was these PLA materials come in some of the most beautiful translucent colors. And one of the unique attributes of this form of filament extrusion 3D printing is you can actually tailor or make the infill, the stuff that's inside of the part. You can tailor that in different types of designs. And it doesn't have to be solid like an injection molded part or a machine part. It's solid inside. And so I started experimenting with different types of what are called infills. In the 3D printing world in those days, people printed with different infills simply to conserve filament because the stuff was expensive and they didn't want to waste it. So they would create these infills that would make the part lighter, but it also conserved materials. I started looking at it and say, aha, this could be a design element. And so you can see in the green section, it's translucent, and you can see that infill pattern, which is like a sinusoidal curve that I developed and do post-processing on my CAD slice files to actually print that way. And so when you look at these things in the light, like this one, you actually see that internal structure. And you can do some really cool things. I've printed reels with people's names in them or their college name as a college graduation gift. Which is really one of the things I enjoy doing is folks will come to me and say, can you print a special reel for a graduation gift or someone who's retiring?
I think I remember seeing a reel that you had printed that had hearts.
Yes, that's a special story. An elderly gentleman, a grandfather, had, I believe she was 13 years old, granddaughter who had just completed her treatment for breast cancer and was a survivor. And he had been fly fishing with her during her treatments. And when she was complete, he wanted to make her a pink fly reel. And somehow or another, I think it was about the time the Hook Shots video came out, he contacted me and said, I made this pink rod. Could you make a special reel for me? I'll, be happy to pay you. I didn't charge him for it. I said, I think I got just the thing. So I call that the Sweetheart reel. I don't have one with me. They're on my website. But it has little hearts for the porting holes in the back. And it's done in this beautiful, beautiful pink that has a little pearlescent to it. And then the spool itself is done with the same sort of open weave 3D pattern. And that was the other thing I was going to point out on the picture. This kind of open weave is the same as the infill that you can see in the translucent part of the colored plastic, but it doesn't have a top or a bottom surface skin. So it's completely exposed, and it's a pattern that's actually woven in 3D. So there's no way that you could actually manufacture this any other way except by additive 3D printing layer by layer. So it's one of the unique things that you can do with 3D printing, and I just incorporate that into my design aesthetic.
That's terrific.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if the microphone has been picking it up. You may have heard some mechanical noises going on in the background. That's because while we've been talking, Michael was kind enough to bring his 3D printer here to the museum. And while we've been talking about his 3D printed reels, we actually have that process taking place.
Yeah.
So
this is actually the second time this printer has been at the museum here.
Yes.
4 or 5 years ago, I was invited to do one of the summer sessions, and I actually had a tent set up out there, and I had this printer set up out there, and I was printing little trout that I was giving away to the kids as they visited, and gave a presentation on my reels at that event. And then shortly thereafter, the museum contacted me about writing an article, which I think you have a copy of.
In fact, they do. So I'm going to pause this particular video here for just a moment. We'll get back to that in just a second. But this is a copy of the journal. This goes back to, it was the summer of 2015. And there's a wonderful article inside. If you go to the AMFF.org website, under the journals tab, you can look back through and read all the copies of the journal. So again, search out summer of 2015 for a tremendous article that Michael put together.
Yeah, and it's a fairly long article, and it's got a lot of photos of my reels, including that Sweetheart reel, the pink one with the hearts.
Right.
It's got one I call Sea Dragon, which has the handle center is a little, you can't see it, the handle center is a little bright red, and the rest of it's kind of this blue-green, so it looks like a dragon. It's really kind of cool.
So how far along are we in the process here?
So we're only about 1/8 of the way through, and as you can see, the part on the left-hand side of your screen with the holes in it, that's the back plate that's going to have the pillars, the 4 pillars, and then the spindle in the middle of it. So it's got a long ways to go. It's printing now the front ring. You can see the foot, just the bottom section of the foot, sort of in the middle of the printer at the lower half. You can see the gear mechanism at the right-hand side. That's going to become the click check. The little round thing that you can see in the bottom right is going to be the little spindle retainer. And then it got exposed in the back there, those two little circular things. Those are going to be the handle and the spindle handle. What's not being printed here is the spool, because I almost always print the spool in a different color material. And so these parts are all the same, and then the spool gets printed in a complementary or whatever material or color or design that I want. This is actually going very slow for demonstrations and like this. I usually slow it down to about a quarter of the speed it would print normally. Normally, I could print this set of parts in about an hour and 45 minutes.
Okay.
And
now, is the printer working obviously on multiple parts simultaneously? And you mentioned, of course, the layering. So is it working in layered sections? So in other words, once a part is complete with that particular layer, it'll move to the next part.
That's exactly right. That's why you see a little bit of all the parts there. It prints one layer for one part, then it moves over and prints the layer for the next part, and then it moves over and prints the layer for the next part. When it's printed all the layers, then it goes back to the beginning and starts that over again until eventually it's completed its mission.
I think that's very cool.
Yeah.
So, Michael, if someone were interested in getting into 3D printing, how would they go about it?
I don't even know how to answer that question. Obviously, you need. Well, I was going to say, obviously, you need a 3D printer. That's not necessarily true, because a lot of public libraries have 3D printers now that they let their users come and print. You can bring your own files, and they'll offer courses, and you can learn how to print them. If you have access to that, it's a great way to go. And then, of course, you can always buy a 3D printer. They're very inexpensive now as compared to when I was getting into it. You can, for a few $100s, buy a low-end printer. It's going to take a little bit more finagling and a little bit more learning to get good quality parts out of it. All the way up to some really high-end consumer-oriented printers for around $1,000 that you push a button. It actually kind of breaks my heart. I have a printer that I got last December, a year ago, December, and I literally just push a button. I don't even have to look at the printer. I just walk away, and when I come back, the parts are beautiful, like this beautiful. It took me years to develop the techniques to get parts to fit my aesthetics and come off the printer looking beautiful. But now you can do it with just a click of a button. So that's the way to go. And then for the actual models, there are the big site out there is called Thingiverse, THINGIVERSE.com. And all it is a storehouse for people like me who want to donate their designs for others to download and print.
Okay. And
so you can actually go to Thingiverse and download all of the files necessary to print one of these fly reels, or you can go to my website, eclecticangler.com, and you can download the files there too. Over the 8 years or so that I've had the files up, I've had somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,500 downloads of them. And I get emails with photos from all over the world, pretty much, if not one a week, several a week, of folks who have printed one of these reels. And they'll usually, it's kind of funny, they'll almost always send me a picture of the reel attached to a rod with a fish that they caught, right? So I've got, I hope they're doing good catch and release practices, but I've got a lot of photographs of these reels with the fish that they caught, hundreds of them. I don't know how many reels have been printed, but I know hundreds of them because I've seen them in some of the wildest color combinations. One guy printed every part in different neon color, which was interesting. Not my jelly, but he seemed to like it. From all over the world, like I said, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, all over Europe, UK, all over North America, all South America, many little countries. They just pop up all over the place. So,
well, like other reel makers, I suspect that Michael is much happier learning that people are actually using his reels to catch fish. 3D printed reels are very interesting, colorful, and I dare say, at least from the start, innovative. And I'm sure that you're very proud of the work that you put into these, especially when you get to see firsthand the results from people all over the world. I think
that's what I like, is that, it really, people can print one of these things for, there's like 30 cents worth of plastic in them, really. And if you have access to a printer like at a library, you can print one and have yourself a perfectly functioning piece of equipment to fish with.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we've got the summer 2015 issue of the Journal for those that are interested. Michael, would you like to give your website out one more time?
Yeah, it's Eclectic Angler. So a lot of people mess up and say electric, but it's eclecticangler.com. That's my website. You get more information on the reels and other things that I do there.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming
Yeah,
today and sharing
thank you.
the process with us. And I hope that folks have enjoyed this. I know I have. I've learned quite a bit today from Michael, and I think that the 3D printing is just, it's very cool. And the fact that these things work all over the world to catch big fish is wonderful.
Yeah.
So if you've enjoyed this, I would certainly encourage you to check out some of the previous episodes of Real Talk. They're available online at the AMFF.org website. If you're not already a member of the museum, I certainly encourage you to join us. Once again, you can get the information from AMFF.org. So, Michael, thank you for coming
Yeah,
again.
thank you.
I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.